There is a moment, somewhere between the alarm clock and the first decision of the day, where your entire future gets quietly decided. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way, not with thunder or fireworks, just a small, almost invisible choice. Do you get up or do you stay down? Do you do the hard thing or do you reach for the easy one? Most people never notice this moment because they have spent their whole lives sleepwalking through it, letting impulse drive while they sit in the passenger seat of their own existence. And here is the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. The quality of your life is not determined by your intelligence, your luck, or even your talent. It is determined by what you do in that quiet moment, over and over again, for years, until it becomes who you are. This is the hidden power of self-discipline. Not the version you have heard about 1,000 times, the one wrapped in grind-set slogans and 5 a.m. wake-up calls. The real version, the one that operates underneath the surface of your daily life, shaping your relationships, your health, your finances, your mind, your entire trajectory, whether you are paying attention to it or not. Self-discipline is not a personality trait reserved for a lucky few. It is a system, a mechanism, and like any mechanism, it can be studied, understood, and rebuilt. Most people think discipline means suffering. They picture clenched jaws, white-knuckled willpower, forcing themselves through gritted teeth to do things they hate. That is not discipline. That is brute force. And brute force always runs out of fuel. Real discipline looks completely different once you understand how it actually works. It is quieter, smarter, and far more sustainable than anything you have been taught. It does not rely on motivation, because motivation is a feeling, and feelings are unreliable. It relies on structure, identity, and design, the same way a river does not need to motivate itself to flow downhill. The path has already been carved. If you do not take control of your own behavior, something else will. Your environment will. Your impulses will. The algorithms feeding you content built to hijack your attention will. Other people's expectations will. Life has an agenda for you, whether or not you have one for yourself. And if you are not actively steering, you are being steered. That is the real meaning behind the second half of this video's title. Control yourself before life controls you. It is not poetic exaggeration. It is a literal description of how human behavior works. There is no neutral state where nothing is shaping you. Either you are the author of your habits, or your habits are being authored by everything around you, often without your consent and often against your own interests. Over the next several chapters, we are going to dismantle the popular myths about self-discipline and replace them with something far more useful. We will look at why willpower alone fails almost everyone who relies on it. We will explore the actual neuroscience behind impulse and restraint, not in a dry academic way, but in a way you can immediately apply to your own life. We will talk about identity, about environment, about the strange relationship between comfort and decay, and about how the people who appear to have superhuman discipline have actually just engineered their lives so that discipline barely feels necessary anymore. By the end, you will not just understand self-discipline intellectually. You will have a working blueprint for installing it into your own daily existence, piece by piece, until it becomes as automatic as breathing. So settle in. This is not a quick motivational pep talk that fades by tomorrow morning. This is a deep structural rebuild of how you relate to yourself, your impulses, and your future. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Myth of Willpower. For decades, self-help culture has sold a particular story about discipline. It goes something like this. Disciplined people simply have more willpower than everyone else. They were born with stronger character, thicker resolve, an internal reservoir of grit that the rest of us are simply missing. If you fail to stick to your diet, your workout plan, your savings goals, the story tells you it is because you are weak. You did not want it badly enough. You lack the moral fiber that successful, disciplined people apparently possess in abundance. This story is not just wrong. It is actively harmful because it sends people on a doomed mission, treating willpower as if it were a fixed trait they either have or do not have, rather than what it actually is, a finite, biologically limited resource that behaves more like a muscle running out of glycogen than a measure of someone's worth as a human being. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively under the term ego depletion. The basic finding, replicated and debated for years, points to something almost every person already intuitively knows from lived experience. The more decisions you make and the more impulses you resist throughout a day, the weaker your capacity to resist the next one becomes. This is why the person who manages to eat a perfectly clean breakfast and lunch often finds themselves face down in a bag of chips at 11 at night. It is not because they suddenly became a weaker person between breakfast and midnight. It is because every act of resistance throughout the day draws from the same limited well, and by nightfall, that well runs dry. Think about your own life for a moment. The days you find it hardest to stick to your goals are rarely the days when you lack motivation in some abstract sense. They are the days that were emotionally exhausting, decision-heavy, or socially draining. A stressful day at work, a difficult conversation with a partner, a morning spent making 100 tiny choices: what to wear, what to eat, how to respond to that email, whether to engage with that argument online. Each of these choices, however small, chips away at the same underlying resource. By the time you reach the moment where you need willpower the most, often in the evening when temptation is highest and supervision is lowest, you have almost nothing left in the tank. This is precisely why relying on willpower as your primary discipline strategy is a structurally flawed approach. It is like trying to win a long war using only the soldiers you have on day one, with no resupply, no reinforcements, no strategy beyond raw force. Eventually, no matter how strong you are, you will be overrun. And when you are overrun, what happens next is almost always worse than the original failure itself. You do not just slip, you spiral. One missed workout becomes a week off. One unhealthy meal becomes a weekend of unraveling. Why? Because the moment willpower fails, the inner narrative kicks in. The same old story rears its head, telling you that you are weak, that you lack discipline, that people like you simply are not cut out for this. And once you believe that story, you stop trying to fight it. Because what is the point of fighting a battle you have already decided you are destined to lose? Here is the reframe that changes everything. People who appear to have extraordinary self-discipline are very rarely winning constant internal battles of pure willpower. They have simply restructured their lives so that fewer battles need to be fought in the first place. The high performer who never seems tempted by junk food at midnight likely never has junk food in the house to begin with. The person who wakes up at 5 every morning without apparent struggle has built an evening routine, a sleep environment, and an identity around being someone who rises early, so that the decision is no longer being made fresh each morning through sheer force of will. They removed the friction before the moment of temptation ever arrived. Discipline, at the highest level, looks less like fighting and more like engineering. The fight has already been won long before the moment of temptation shows up, because the conditions for failure were never set up to begin with. This does not mean willpower is useless. It is a real and valuable resource, especially in moments of genuine crisis or in the early days of building a new habit before the environment and identity have caught up. But willpower was never meant to be the foundation of a disciplined life. It is the emergency reserve, not the daily fuel source. Anyone who builds their entire system of self-control around grinding through resistance every single day is setting themselves up for eventual burnout, because that approach treats the symptom while ignoring the actual structural cause. So if willpower is not the answer, what is? The answer lies in understanding the deeper mechanics behind every human decision, the tug-of-war happening constantly inside your brain between two very different systems, one built for the long term and one built purely for survival in the moment. Understanding this internal battle is the first real step toward winning it, not through brute force, but through strategy. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Chapter 2. The War Inside Your Skull. Every single time you choose between the easy option and the hard one, a war is taking place inside your brain, and you are rarely even aware it is happening. On one side sits what neuroscientists often refer to as the limbic system, the older, more primal part of the brain responsible for emotion, immediate reward, and survival instinct. This system does not care about your 5-year plan. It does not understand delayed gratification, retirement accounts, or the slow compounding benefits of consistent exercise. It cares about one thing only: reducing discomfort and acquiring pleasure right now, in this exact moment, because for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, right now was genuinely all that mattered. If a piece of high-calorie food was available, eating it immediately was the rational choice, because tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed. If rest was available, taking it immediately conserved precious energy for unpredictable threats. The limbic system is not broken. It is simply running software designed for a world that no longer exists. On the other side sits the prefrontal cortex, the newer, more evolutionarily advanced part of the brain responsible for planning, reasoning, impulse control, and long-term thinking. This is the part of you capable of imagining a future version of yourself and making sacrifices today to benefit that future person. It is the part that can look at a slice of cake and think about how it will feel tomorrow morning rather than how it will taste in the next 10 seconds. The prefrontal cortex is remarkable, genuinely one of the most powerful tools in the known universe. But it has a critical weakness. It is metabolically expensive to run, it tires easily, and it is significantly slower than the limbic system. In a head-to-head race between instinct and reason, instinct almost always reaches the finish line first, because emotion is fast and reasoning is slow. This is why knowing the right thing to do is almost never enough. You already know, somewhere deep down, that the late-night scrolling session is stealing your sleep. You already know the extra drink is not serving you. You already know procrastinating on the difficult project is only making tomorrow's version of yourself more stressed. Knowledge was never the missing ingredient. The gap between knowing and doing is not an intelligence gap. It is a neurological one, a structural mismatch between a fast emotional system and a slow rational one, and most people spend their entire lives blaming themselves for a battle that was never fought on equal footing to begin with. Here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, and where the real hidden power begins to reveal itself. You cannot win this war by trying to outmuscle the limbic system through pure rational force in the heat of the moment. By the time you are standing in front of the refrigerator at midnight, the emotional brain has already activated, already flooded your system with the craving, already started the countdown to surrender. Trying to reason your way out of that moment is like trying to stop a wave with a calculator. It is the wrong tool for the wrong moment. The real leverage point exists earlier, long before the war begins, in the design of your environment and your routines, where the rational brain still has the upper hand because no craving has been triggered yet. This is the principle that separates people who appear effortlessly disciplined from everyone else. They do not wait for the battle. They make decisions ahead of time, while the prefrontal cortex is calm, clear-headed, and fully in charge. And they design their surroundings so that when the limbic system eventually does activate, there is very little for it to actually act on. They lay out their workout clothes the night before, when motivation is irrelevant, because no decision needs to be made in real time. They meal prep on a Sunday afternoon, so that at 7 in the evening on a Wednesday, exhausted and emotionally depleted, there is no decision to make at all, only a container to open. They delete the apps, they leave the credit card at home. They tell a friend about their goal so that social accountability does the heavy lifting that willpower never could. This is what we mean when we say self-discipline is not about fighting harder in the moment. It is about negotiating the terms of the battle long before it starts. Every time you remove a future decision from the equation, you are essentially preloading a win, banking a victory, while your rational brain still holds the advantage. So that later, when the emotional brain wakes up, hungry and impulsive, it finds nothing to grab onto. Understanding this changes the entire emotional relationship you have with your own behavior. You stop seeing failure as a personal moral defect and start seeing it as useful data, a signal pointing directly at a structural weakness in your environment or your routine. Did not stick to the diet. That is not proof you are weak. That is proof your environment still contains too many cues for the old behavior. Did not get up early? That is not proof you lack discipline. That is proof your evening routine is still working against your morning goals. This shift, from self-blame to system diagnosis, might be the single most important mental adjustment anyone can make on the road to genuine, lasting self-control. Because shame paralyzes people while curiosity moves them forward. In the next chapter, we are going to look closer at exactly how these environmental cues hijack behavior, and more importantly, how to flip them so they start working for you instead of against you. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Temptation. Imagine two people trying to quit eating sugar. Person 1 relies entirely on willpower, gritting their teeth every time they walk past the pantry, white-knuckling through every craving, treating every single day as a fresh battle to be fought from scratch. Person 2 simply does not buy sugar. There is none in the house. when the craving hits at 9 at night. There is nothing readily available to satisfy it, and the effort required to go out, get in a car, and purchase something sweet is just high enough that the craving usually passes before the behavior ever happens. Which person do you think succeeds more often, more consistently, with less suffering? The answer is obvious. And yet most people approach their own goals exactly like person one, relying on raw internal force while completely ignoring the external environment that is quietly sabotaging them at every turn. Human behavior is far more influenced by environment than most people are comfortable admitting. We like to believe we are rational agents, making free, conscious choices in every moment. But the research on this topic paints a very different picture. Where things are placed, how visible they are, how much effort is required to access them. All of these tiny environmental variables shape behavior more powerfully than internal resolve ever could. There is a well-known finding from behavioral research showing that simply moving unhealthy snacks from eye level to a slightly less convenient location in a cafeteria can dramatically reduce how often people choose them, even though the snacks are still technically available. Nothing about willpower changed. The environment changed, and behavior followed. This single insight, once truly understood, becomes one of the most powerful tools available for building self-discipline. Instead of asking the exhausting question, how do I force myself to resist temptation? The far more useful question becomes, how do I redesign my surroundings so that temptation barely exists in the first place? This is not weakness. This is intelligence. The strongest, most disciplined people in the world are not constantly resisting urges through sheer force of character. They have simply engineered urges out of existence by controlling what they allow into their environment to begin with. Think about your own phone for a moment. If notifications are on, if the apps that consume your time are sitting right there on the home screen, one tap away, you are essentially declaring war on your own focus every single time you pick up the device. The fight has been rigged against you before it even begins. But move those apps to a folder, buried 3 screens deep, turn off notifications, and add a small friction step, and something remarkable happens. The craving for distraction does not disappear entirely, but the gap between impulse and action grows just wide enough for the rational brain to step back in. That small gap, sometimes lasting only 10 or 15 seconds, is often all that stands between a wasted evening and a productive one. This principle extends to every domain of life. Want to read more? Leave the book open on your pillow and the phone charging in another room. Want to exercise consistently? Keep your gear by the door. Or better yet, sleep in your workout clothes, so the first decision of the morning has already been made for you. Want to stop overspending? Remove saved card details from shopping apps so that every purchase requires manually retyping 16 digits, a tiny friction that is often enough to interrupt impulsive buying before it happens. None of these strategies require additional willpower. In fact, they require the opposite. They require using your willpower once in a calm moment to design a system so that you never need large amounts of willpower again in the heat of the moment. There is a deeper psychological principle at play here as well. Something researchers refer to as the path of least resistance. Human beings are wired to default to whatever requires the least effort in any given moment. And this is not a character flaw. It is an energy conservation mechanism baked in by millions of years of evolution. The brain treats effort as a cost, almost in the same way it treats calories, and it will always seek out the cheapest available option unless something interrupts that default pattern. The genius move is not to fight this tendency. It is to hijack it. If the easiest, lowest effort option in any environment happens to be the disciplined choice, the brain will gravitate toward it automatically, without any internal battle required at all. This is why the most successful systems for behavior change are almost always invisible from the outside. Nobody sees the late night spent removing junk food from the kitchen, or the decision to leave the running shoes by the front door, or the choice to log out of every streaming app so a password has to be retyped each time. All anyone sees is a person who seems to just naturally make good choices, day after day, without apparent struggle. They have not transcended human nature. They have simply learned to work with it instead of against it. Of course, environment alone is not the entire story. Even the most perfectly engineered surroundings cannot save someone whose internal identity is still fundamentally misaligned with the behavior they are trying to build. You can remove every cookie from the house, but if a person still sees themselves, deep down, as someone who simply isn't disciplined, that identity will eventually find a way to reassert itself, often in unexpected and frustrating ways. This brings us to perhaps the single most powerful and most overlooked factor in the entire discipline equation: the silent, invisible force of identity, and exactly how it quietly overrides every plan, every system, and every piece of willpower you think you have. Chapter 4. The Identity Override. There is a strange and counterintuitive truth buried inside human psychology that explains why so many people sabotage their own progress right at the moment they begin to succeed. It explains why someone who loses 30 pounds after months of disciplined effort slowly gains it all back over the following year. It explains why someone who finally builds healthy savings after years of living paycheck to paycheck suddenly makes an enormous, unnecessary purchase that wipes the account back down to zero. It explains why talented people self-sabotage right before a breakthrough, why relationships fall apart right as they start to deepen, why discipline seems to hold for a while and then mysteriously collapses, almost as if some invisible hand reaches in and pulls everything back toward where it started. That invisible hand has a name. Psychologists and behavior researchers refer to it as identity-based behavior, sometimes called the self-concept, and it might be the single most underestimated force in all of human behavior change. The basic principle is deceptively simple. Human beings are constantly, unconsciously, working to behave in ways that match the internal story they hold about who they are. If your internal identity says, "I am someone who struggles with money," then no amount of temporary financial discipline will hold, because your subconscious mind will eventually find a way to bring your external circumstances back in line with your internal self-image. The discipline was never the problem. The identity underneath it was quietly working against the entire project, the entire time. This explains something that confuses almost everyone who has ever tried to change a habit purely through behavior modification alone. You can force yourself to act differently for a while, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, riding on motivation, willpower, or sheer stubborn determination. But if the underlying identity has not shifted alongside the behavior, the gap between who you are acting like and who you actually believe yourself to be creates an enormous amount of internal tension. And tension, left unresolved, always seeks release. Eventually, almost predictably, the behavior snaps back toward whatever matches the identity, because consistency between self-image and behavior is one of the most powerful psychological forces driving human action, even stronger, in many cases, than the desire for the outcome itself. This is precisely why lasting self-discipline cannot be built purely through external systems and environmental engineering. As powerful as those tools are, they need to be paired with a parallel, internal shift in identity, or the gains will always be temporary. A rubber band stretched outward that eventually snaps back to its resting shape. The real, lasting version of discipline is not built by forcing yourself to do disciplined things. It is built by slowly, deliberately becoming a person for whom those disciplined things feel natural, automatic, and aligned rather than forced. So how does one actually shift identity? This is not about empty affirmations recited in a mirror, repeating hollow phrases that the subconscious mind does not actually believe. Identity shifts happen through evidence, not declaration. Every single time you perform a small action consistent with the identity you want to build, you are casting a vote for that new version of yourself. One healthy meal is a vote for the identity of someone who takes care of their body. One morning of getting up on time is a vote for the identity of someone who follows through. These votes seem insignificant individually, almost laughably small. But identity is not built through grand, dramatic gestures. It is built through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of small, consistent evidence, repeated so many times that the brain eventually updates its internal model of who you actually are. This is also why starting unbelievably small is one of the most underrated strategies in all of behavior change. Despite sounding almost too simple to work, a single push-up a day sounds laughably insufficient to anyone, focused purely on physical results. But the goal of that single push-up is never really about the muscle. It is about casting a vote, showing your own subconscious mind concrete evidence that you are someone who follows through on commitments to yourself, no matter how small. Once that identity begins to solidify, even slightly, the behavior naturally begins to expand on its own. Because now the behavior is being pulled forward by identity rather than pushed forward by willpower, and pulled behavior is dramatically more sustainable than pushed behavior. In nearly every documented case, there is also a darker, more uncomfortable side to this principle, one that deserves honest attention rather than avoidance. Just as positive identity statements compound into positive behavior over time, negative ones compound just as powerfully in the opposite direction. Every time you say, out loud or silently in your own head, "I am lazy," "I always quit," "I have no self-control," you are not simply describing your current behavior. You are actively reinforcing the exact identity that produces more of that very behavior in the future. Language is never neutral. The words you repeatedly use to describe yourself become instructions your subconscious mind follows with disturbing obedience, almost as if it is simply trying to keep your external reality consistent with your internal self-talk. This does not mean lying to yourself with toxic positivity, pretending to be someone you are clearly not yet. That approach tends to backfire, because the subconscious mind is remarkably good at detecting dishonesty, even when it originates from your own inner voice. The real skill lies somewhere more subtle and more honest. Speaking to yourself in terms of direction and trajectory, rather than fixed, permanent labels. Not "I am disciplined," full stop, as if it were already a finished, static fact. Instead, I am becoming someone who follows through. A phrase that is honest about the current process, while still pointing decisively toward the desired identity. This framing keeps the subconscious mind on board because it does not require believing a flat-out lie. It only requires acknowledging an ongoing, observable process already quietly in motion. Once identity and environment start working together instead of fighting each other, something remarkable begins to happen. Discipline stops feeling like discipline at all. It starts feeling like simply being yourself. And that shift, from forcing behavior to embodying it, is exactly the territory we are about to explore next, as we look at the strange and often misunderstood relationship between comfort, discomfort, and long-term growth. Chapter 5. The Comfort Trap. There is a quiet, almost invisible danger lurking inside modern life. One that has nothing to do with obvious external threats and everything to do with comfort itself. Human beings, throughout almost the entirety of their evolutionary history, lived in conditions of scarcity, unpredictability, and physical hardship. Food was not guaranteed. Shelter required constant maintenance. Physical effort was unavoidable, woven into the basic mechanics of survival. The body and mind evolved within that context, calibrated to function, even thrive, under a baseline level of stress and physical demand. Then, within an extraordinary short span of historical time, that entire context vanished for a significant portion of the world's population. Food became abundant and instantly accessible. Physical effort became optional rather than mandatory. Comfort became the default setting of daily existence rather than a rare luxury. And while this transformation has undeniably reduced certain forms of suffering, it has also created a strange and under-examined new problem, one that very few people are taught to recognize. The human system, deprived of the natural friction it evolved to handle, does not simply relax into a state of permanent contentment. It begins slowly and almost imperceptibly to atrophy. This is the comfort trap, and it operates with a kind of quiet cruelty precisely because it never announces itself. Nobody wakes up one morning and consciously decides to surrender their discipline, their resilience, their capacity for hard things. It happens in tiny, almost invisible increments, each one so small it feels harmless in isolation. The elevator instead of the stairs. Just this once. The notification checked instead of the work task tackled, just for a moment. The slightly easier option chosen over and over. Each individual decision genuinely trivial, until one day a person looks up and realizes that an entire life has been quietly constructed around the avoidance of even minor discomfort. And that the muscle required to do hard things, the literal psychological capacity for sustained effort, has withered from chronic disuse. Here lies one of the most important and most consistently overlooked truths about self-discipline. Discomfort is not the enemy of a good life. It is one of the primary mechanisms through which growth, resilience, and capability are built in the first place. This applies almost universally across domains. Muscles do not grow from comfortable, easy movement. They grow specifically from controlled exposure to resistance, micro tears in the fiber that the body then repairs stronger than before. Mental resilience follows an almost identical pattern, growing not from the avoidance of difficulty but from repeated, manageable exposure to it. A person who has never faced hardship Never pushed through resistance. Never sat with the uncomfortable feeling of wanting to quit and chosen to continue anyway. Simply does not develop the internal infrastructure required to handle larger difficulties when they eventually arrive. And they always eventually arrive because life does not grant permanent exemptions from hardship to anyone. This explains a phenomenon that puzzles many people from the outside: the observation that individuals who deliberately choose difficult paths, demanding athletic training, challenging academic pursuits, ambitious entrepreneurial ventures, often report higher levels of life satisfaction and self-respect than those who have organized their entire existence around minimizing friction and difficulty. This is not because suffering itself is virtuous in some abstract, romanticized sense. It is because the regular, voluntary confrontation with manageable discomfort builds something that comfort alone simply cannot produce: a deep, embodied sense of personal capability, the quiet, internal knowledge that you are someone who can do hard things when hard things are required. That knowledge, once earned through repeated experience rather than simply claimed through positive thinking, becomes one of the most stable foundations for genuine, lasting self-confidence available to any human being. This is where the concept of voluntary discomfort becomes such a powerful tool for rebuilding discipline from the ground up. The idea is not to manufacture unnecessary suffering for its own sake, but to deliberately, consciously choose small doses of difficulty on a regular basis, specifically in order to keep the psychological capacity for handling discomfort active and strong, rather than allowing it to atrophy through constant avoidance. Taking a cold shower when a hot one would be easier, walking instead of driving for a short distance, choosing the harder version of a workout when a lighter one is available, sitting with a craving for several minutes instead of immediately satisfying it, simply to practice the experience of discomfort without collapse. None of these individual actions matter much in isolation. Their power lies entirely in repetition, in the cumulative signal sent to the brain day after day that discomfort is survivable, manageable, even useful, rather than something to be feared and avoided at all costs. There is a profound psychological shift that occurs once a person begins regularly practicing voluntary discomfort. The relationship with difficulty itself begins to change. Hard things stop being interpreted as threats to be avoided and start being interpreted as opportunities, familiar territory rather than dangerous unknown ground. This shift alone dramatically increases a person's capacity for sustained discipline in every area of life. Because so much of what causes discipline to collapse is not the actual difficulty of the task itself, but the emotional panic response triggered by discomfort. A response that voluntary, controlled exposure gradually trains the nervous system to handle with far greater composure. It is worth being honest about something here. Something the broader self-improvement industry often glosses over in its rush to sell easy, comfortable solutions. Building this capacity is not instantly comfortable. There is no version of this process that feels effortless from day one. The first cold shower is genuinely unpleasant. The first few weeks of an early wake-up routine genuinely involve real internal resistance. But this discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the exact mechanism through which the underlying capability is being built. The same way muscle soreness after a workout is not damage, but evidence of productive adaptation already taking place beneath the surface. Understanding this distinction between damaging discomfort and growth-producing discomfort is essential because the goal was never to suffer needlessly. The goal is to deliberately, strategically reintroduce just enough friction back into a life that has been engineered, almost accidentally, to remove all of it, and in doing so, to rebuild the very capacity for self-control that comfort had quietly been eroding all along. We have now covered the foundational architecture of self-discipline, the failure of pure willpower, the internal neurological battle between instinct and reason, the overlooked power of environmental design, the silent override of identity, and the hidden cost of excessive comfort. In the next section, we move into the more advanced mechanics, the role of habits and triggers, the science of delayed gratification, and the practical frameworks that turn all of this understanding into a daily, lived reality. Chapter 6. The Habit Loop. Every habit you currently run, whether it serves you or quietly destroys you, follows the exact same underlying structure, a structure that researchers have mapped out in remarkable detail over the past several decades. It begins with a cue, some signal in your environment or internal state that tells your brain a particular sequence is about to begin. The cue could be a time of day, a location, an emotional state, the presence of another person, or even just the completion of some preceding action. Following the cue comes the routine itself, the actual behavior, whether that behavior is reaching for a cigarette, opening a social media app, lacing up running shoes, or pouring a glass of water first thing in the morning. And finally, closing the loop, comes the reward, the payoff your brain receives that reinforces the entire sequence and makes it more likely to fire again the next time the same cue appears. This loop is not some abstract psychological theory. It is a literal, physical pattern carved into neural pathways through repetition. And once it has been carved deeply enough, it becomes almost automatic, operating below the level of conscious awareness. This is precisely why habits feel so different from ordinary decisions. A decision requires deliberate thought, weighing options, considering consequences. A habit requires none of that. The brain has essentially built a shortcut, bypassing the slow, effortful deliberation of the prefrontal cortex entirely because the pattern has been run so many times that conscious thought is no longer necessary to execute it. This explains why simply trying to stop a bad habit through sheer determination so often fails, and fails in a strangely consistent way. People do not usually decide, in a fully conscious moment, to give in to a habit they are trying to break. Instead, they find themselves already halfway through the routine before they even notice what is happening. The phone already in hand, the bag of chips already open, the cigarette already lit. The cue triggered the routine automatically, the way a key turns a lock, long before conscious awareness ever entered the picture. By the time awareness arrives, the behavior is already well underway, and stopping mid-routine requires a completely different, far more difficult kind of effort than preventing the routine from starting in the first place. This is why the most effective approach to changing a habit is rarely about attacking the routine itself. The far more strategic move is to identify and interrupt the cue, or alternatively, to keep the cue and the reward exactly the same while substituting a different routine in between. This second strategy deserves particular attention because it explains why so many habit change attempts fail in a predictable way. Someone trying to quit smoking who focuses purely on willpower is fighting the routine directly, gritting their teeth against the urge every single time the cue appears. But someone who understands the loop will instead ask, what is the actual reward this habit is providing? Is it a nicotine hit? A few minutes of solitude away from a stressful environment? A social ritual shared with co-workers? A brief sense of control during an otherwise overwhelming day? Once the true underlying reward is identified, a new routine can be substituted, one that delivers a similar reward through a healthier mechanism, while the cue and reward stay structurally intact. And the only thing that changes is the behavior sitting in the middle. This reframing is liberating for anyone who has spent years blaming themselves for failing to break a habit through pure force of will. The habit was never simply a moral failing. It was a fully functioning loop, delivering a real psychological reward. And no amount of guilt or self-criticism was ever going to dismantle a structure that the brain had built specifically because it worked. The path forward was never about fighting harder. It was about understanding the architecture well enough to redesign it intelligently. There is another layer to this that deserves careful attention, something often referred to as habit stacking. Because the brain already has so many existing automatic loops running throughout the day, one of the most efficient ways to install a new habit is to deliberately attach it to an existing one, using an already established routine as the cue for the new behavior, rather than trying to create an entirely new cue from scratch. After I pour my morning coffee, I will write down 3 priorities for the day. After I brush my teeth at night, I will lay out tomorrow's clothes. The existing habit, already running on autopilot, becomes the launching pad for the new one, dramatically reducing the amount of conscious effort required during the fragile early period, when a habit has not yet become automatic. This brings us to perhaps the most important and most frequently misunderstood aspect of habit formation: the role of time. Popular culture has spread a specific number, 21 days, as the supposed universal timeline required to form a new habit. This number is not accurate, and clinging to it sets people up for unnecessary disappointment. Research examining actual habit formation across real participants found enormous variation, with some habits taking as little as 18 days to feel automatic, and others taking well over 200 days, depending heavily on the complexity of the behavior and the consistency of repetition. The lesson here is not a specific number to memorize, but a deeper truth to internalize. Habit formation is not a fixed sprint with a guaranteed finish line at a predetermined date. It is a gradual, individualized process, and expecting automaticity too early, then feeling like a failure when a behavior still requires conscious effort after 3 weeks, causes many people to abandon habits right before they would have eventually taken hold on their own. Patience, in this context, is not a soft, passive virtue. It is a strategic necessity, a recognition that the early, effortful phase of any new habit is temporary, a cost paid up front in exchange for a future where the same behavior requires almost no conscious effort at all. Understanding the loop, the cue, the routine, and the reward, combined with realistic expectations about the actual timeline involved, transforms habit formation from a mysterious, frustrating struggle into a process that can be deliberately engineered, one loop at a time, until an entire identity has been quietly rebuilt from the ground up. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth examining closely: something that explains why certain habits seem to lock in almost permanently, while others, despite months of effort, never quite stick. The strength of any habit loop is directly tied to the intensity and consistency of the reward it delivers. And rewards are not all created equal. A reward that arrives immediately, vividly, and reliably will carve a far deeper neural groove than one that is delayed, vague, or inconsistent, even if the delayed reward is objectively more valuable in the long run. This is precisely why habits built around immediate sensory pleasure, sugar, screens, social validation, tend to entrench themselves so quickly and so stubbornly, while habits built around abstract future benefits, exercise, saving money, studying, often struggle to take hold even when a person is fully convinced of their importance. The practical implication here is significant. When building a new, beneficial habit, it is not enough to rely on the distant, eventual payoff alone. The loop needs an immediate reward attached to it as well, something the brain can register right away as a genuine win, separate from the long-term benefit that will only materialize much later. This might mean pairing a new habit with a small, immediate pleasure, a favorite song played only during a workout, a satisfying checkmark on a visible tracker, a few minutes of guilt-free relaxation immediately following a completed task. These small, engineered rewards are not a sign of weakness or a crutch. They are a deliberate, intelligent acknowledgement of how the brain's reward system actually operates, bridging the gap between the distant, true benefit and the immediate reinforcement the loop requires in order to take root and eventually run on its own. Chapter 7. The Tyranny of Now. There exists a famous psychological experiment conducted decades ago involving young children, a marshmallow, and a simple offer. Eat one marshmallow now, or wait a short period of time alone in a room and receive 2 marshmallows later. The children's responses to this simple test, and more specifically, their ability to delay gratification in pursuit of a larger future reward, turned out to correlate with a striking range of life outcomes measured years and even decades later, including academic performance, professional success, and overall life stability. While later research has refined and complicated the original findings, adding important nuance around socioeconomic context and trust in promised rewards, the core insight at the heart of this research remains one of the most important concepts in the entire study of self-discipline. The capacity to delay gratification, to choose a larger reward later over a smaller reward now, sits at the very center of what it means to be a disciplined human being. This capacity is under unprecedented assault in the modern world, and understanding why requires looking honestly at the environment most people now inhabit every single day. For nearly the entirety of human history, immediate gratification was relatively difficult to access on demand. Food required preparation, entertainment required other people, instruments, or significant effort. Social connection required physical presence. Stimulation of almost every kind required time, energy, or resources that were not always readily available. This natural scarcity of instant reward meant that human psychology was rarely required to resist powerful, engineered temptation on a constant, continuous basis. Delayed gratification was simply easier to practice, because instant gratification was rarely sitting within arm's reach. That world no longer exists for most people. Entertainment is available within a single tap, engineered by teams of behavioral scientists specifically to maximize engagement and minimize any friction between impulse and reward. Food is available within minutes through delivery apps. Social validation arrives instantly through likes and comments. Every major platform competing for your attention has a direct financial incentive to shorten the distance between your impulse and your reward as much as technologically possible, because shorter distances mean higher engagement, and higher engagement means higher profit. You are not simply living in a world that happens to contain more temptation than the world your grandparents inhabited. You are living inside carefully engineered systems specifically designed by extraordinarily intelligent people whose entire job is to make delayed gratification as difficult as possible for you to practice. Understanding this should fundamentally change how you think about your own struggles with discipline in the modern world. If you find it difficult to resist checking your phone, to resist the next episode, to resist the impulsive purchase with one-click checkout already enabled, this is not necessarily a sign of unusual personal weakness. It is evidence that you are living inside an environment engineered, often by some of the most sophisticated psychological research available, specifically to erode the exact capacity you are trying to strengthen. This does not excuse surrender, but it does demand a level of strategic awareness that previous generations simply did not need in order to maintain reasonable self-control. So, how does one actually rebuild the capacity for delayed gratification in an environment engineered against it? The first step involves something researchers call temporal discounting, the tendency of the human brain to dramatically undervalue future rewards compared to immediate ones, even when the future reward is objectively far larger. A reward available right now feels enormous, vivid, and real, while a reward available next month feels abstract, distant, almost theoretical, even if it is objectively worth significantly more. This is not a character flaw. It is a basic feature of how human cognition evaluates time. And it explains why purely intellectual knowledge of long-term benefits so rarely overpowers the pull of immediate reward in the actual moment of decision. The practical solution involves deliberately making future rewards feel more vivid and present, while simultaneously making immediate rewards feel less appealing through added friction or delay. Visualization plays a surprisingly powerful role here, not in some vague, mystical sense, but in a concrete, neurological one. When a person vividly imagines a specific future outcome in rich sensory detail, the brain processes that imagined future with significantly more weight than an abstract, distant goal stated in vague terms. Someone trying to save money benefits far more from vividly imagining the specific feeling of financial security, the exact moment of paying off a specific debt, than from a vague, abstract goal like, "I want to save more money." The vividness itself increases the perceived value of the delayed reward, partially closing the gap that temporal discounting otherwise creates. The second practical tool involves deliberately inserting friction between impulse and immediate reward, buying time for the slower, more rational part of the brain to catch up and participate in the decision. This is sometimes called the 10-minute rule, a simple but remarkably effective practice of committing to wait just 10 minutes before acting on any strong impulse. Whether that impulse involves an unplanned purchase, an extra episode, or a late-night snack that was not part of the plan. 10 minutes is short enough to feel achievable even in a moment of strong craving, yet long enough, in many cases, for the initial intensity of the impulse to noticeably fade, allowing a more considered decision to take its place. This single habit, practiced consistently over time, gradually retrains the brain's relationship with impulse itself, building tolerance for the discomfort of waiting, rather than treating every urge as something that must be immediately resolved. There is a deeper truth embedded in all of this that deserves explicit recognition. Every single act of delayed gratification, however small, however seemingly insignificant, functions as a form of training, strengthening the same underlying neural capacity used for every other act of self-control in your life. The person who can resist checking their phone for an extra 10 minutes during focused work is exercising the exact same psychological muscle required to resist an unhealthy food choice, to stick with a difficult exercise routine, to stay calm during a heated argument, rather than reacting impulsively. Delayed gratification is not a separate, isolated skill confined to financial decisions or marshmallow experiments. It is the underlying engine running beneath nearly every domain where self-discipline matters. And strengthening it in one area produces measurable spillover benefits in nearly every other. It is also worth naming a specific modern trap that deserves particular attention: the experience of reaching for a quick 5-minute scroll and somehow resurfacing 45 minutes later with no memory of how the time disappeared. This is not simply a matter of losing track of time casually. Infinite scroll feeds are deliberately engineered without natural stopping cues. The small completion signals that once existed in older forms of media, the end of a television episode, the last page of a magazine article, the closing credits of a film. Without these natural boundaries, the brain receives no signal to pause and evaluate whether continuing still serves any purpose. And the habit loop simply keeps firing, reward after reward, with nothing ever interrupting the chain. Rebuilding delayed gratification in this specific context often requires manually reinserting the boundaries that the technology itself has deliberately removed. A timer, a scheduled stopping point decided in advance, a physical barrier like leaving the room or handing the device to someone else. Anything that restores the natural pause. The design of the platform was specifically built to eliminate. Chapter 8. The Energy Economy. There is a persistent, deeply flawed assumption embedded in most conversations about discipline: the idea that self-control is purely a matter of mindset, that with the right attitude, the right motivation, the right mental framework, anyone can power through any level of fatigue, stress, or physical depletion. This assumption ignores a fundamental biological reality. Self-discipline does not exist independently of the physical body. It is, in a very literal sense, a function of the brain, and the brain, like every other organ, requires adequate fuel, rest, and physiological stability in order to function at a high level. Trying to exercise strong self-discipline while running on insufficient sleep, poor nutrition, and chronic stress is roughly equivalent to trying to win a race in a car that has not been properly maintained, no matter how skilled or determined the driver happens to be. Sleep deprivation in particular has been shown repeatedly and consistently to dramatically impair exactly the cognitive functions most essential to self-control. The prefrontal cortex, already established as the seat of long-term reasoning and impulse regulation, is disproportionately affected by inadequate sleep compared to other brain regions. After a night of poor or insufficient sleep, the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the more impulsive, reward-seeking limbic system weakens significantly, while at the same time, The limbic system's response to immediate rewards, particularly high-calorie food and other instant gratifications, actually intensifies. In other words, sleep deprivation simultaneously weakens your brakes and presses harder on your accelerator. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a direct, measurable explanation for why even people with strong values and clear goals consistently make worse decisions when they are running on insufficient rest, and why so many discipline failures cluster around periods of poor sleep, without anyone ever connecting the two. Nutrition operates on a remarkably similar principle, though it receives far less attention in popular discussions of discipline. The brain, despite representing a relatively small percentage of total body weight, consumes a disproportionately large share of the body's overall energy expenditure, and it is particularly sensitive to fluctuations in blood sugar. When blood sugar drops significantly, often as a result of skipped meals or diets heavy in rapidly digested refined carbohydrates that cause sharp spikes, followed by equally sharp crashes, cognitive function suffers immediately and measurably, including the specific cognitive functions responsible for impulse control and rational decision-making. This is precisely why so many people find themselves making their worst, most impulsive decisions, eating poorly, snapping at loved ones, abandoning carefully made plans during periods of low blood sugar, often without any conscious awareness of the underlying physiological cause. The mind feels like it is failing morally in these moments, but in reality it is failing biologically, starved of the stable fuel supply it requires to function as intended. Chronic stress adds yet another significant layer to this equation, one that operates through a different but equally powerful mechanism. When the body perceives ongoing, sustained stress, it maintains persistently elevated levels of cortisol, a hormone whose primary evolutionary function was to prepare the body for short-term emergencies, immediate physical threats requiring rapid mobilization of energy. Cortisol, in short bursts, is genuinely useful, sharpening focus and readying the body for decisive action. But when stress becomes chronic rather than acute, when cortisol remains elevated for weeks or months rather than minutes, it begins actively impairing the prefrontal cortex while simultaneously strengthening the influence of the more reactive, impulsive parts of the brain. This produces a particularly cruel irony. The periods of life when discipline matters most, periods of high stress, significant responsibility, and mounting pressure, are precisely the periods when the underlying neurological capacity for discipline is most severely compromised by the body's own stress response. It is worth adding that even mild, frequently overlooked physiological states can quietly erode self-control without ever being recognized as the actual culprit. Mild dehydration, for instance, has been linked in research to measurable declines in concentration, mood stability, and cognitive performance, despite rarely being considered a serious issue by most people going about an ordinary day. Sitting for extended, unbroken periods without any form of micro-recovery. A brief stretch, a short walk, even a few deep, deliberate breaths, gradually accumulates physical tension and mental fatigue that quietly chips away at the same finite resource discipline depends on. None of these factors alone are dramatic. None of them announce themselves the way exhaustion or hunger clearly do. But their cumulative effect across an ordinary day is significant. And people who maintain consistently strong self-control over long periods are often, whether consciously or not, The same people who have built small, regular habits of physiological maintenance throughout the day, rather than waiting for depletion to become severe before addressing it. Understanding this energy economy fundamentally reframes how discipline should actually be approached at a practical level. Rather than treating sleep, nutrition, and stress management as separate, optional wellness categories disconnected from the serious business of building discipline, they must be understood as the literal infrastructure upon which all discipline depends. A person attempting to build extraordinary self-control while neglecting these foundational physiological needs is essentially trying to construct an elaborate building on top of an unstable, crumbling foundation, and no amount of architectural sophistication in the upper floors can compensate for instability underneath. This does not mean discipline becomes impossible during periods of poor sleep, inadequate nutrition, or high stress. Human beings are remarkably resilient and frequently manage to exercise meaningful self-control, even under suboptimal physiological conditions. But it does mean that expecting consistent, sustainable discipline without addressing these underlying physiological factors is setting an unnecessarily difficult, almost adversarial condition for yourself, fighting an uphill battle against your own depleted biology, while simultaneously trying to resist external temptation. The far more strategic approach treats physical foundations as the first and most essential layer of any serious discipline-building plan. Recognizing that an extra hour of quality sleep, a stable, balanced meal, or a genuine stress reduction practice often produces more improvement in actual self-control than weeks of effort focused purely on willpower and motivation alone, because those efforts are finally being supported by a brain that has the actual physiological resources required to execute them. Physical movement deserves a specific mention here as well, separate from sleep and nutrition, because its effect on self-control operates through a slightly different mechanism. Regular physical exercise has been shown to increase the brain's available resources for executive function, partly through improved blood flow and partly through the regulation of stress hormones and mood-related neurotransmitters that directly influence the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate impulse. This is why a short walk, a brief workout, or even a few minutes of vigorous movement can often produce an almost immediate improvement in mental clarity and self-control, far faster than the kind of long-term physiological change associated with sleep or diet. Many people instinctively reach for sedentary distractions when they feel mentally depleted. Scrolling, snacking, collapsing onto a couch, when the more effective response, paradoxically, is often the opposite. Movement, which actively restores the resource being depleted rather than further draining it through passive consumption. Chapter 9. Identity through friction. There is a quiet phenomenon that occurs in the lives of people who manage to sustain extraordinary discipline over long periods of time. Something rarely discussed openly, because it sounds almost paradoxical at first. The friction does not disappear. The difficulty does not vanish. What changes is the relationship the person holds with that difficulty. A relationship transformed not through some mystical shift in personality, but through the accumulated, repeated experience of choosing the harder path and discovering again and again that they survived it, that the discomfort was temporary, that the version of themselves capable of enduring it was real and reliable rather than a fragile illusion. This is the deeper function that friction serves beyond the purely physiological adaptations discussed in earlier chapters. Each time a person deliberately chooses resistance over ease, even in small, seemingly trivial ways, they are gathering direct, undeniable evidence about their own capability, evidence that no amount of external encouragement or motivational content can substitute for. Someone can be told 1,000 times that they are capable of hard things, and that message, however well-intentioned, remains essentially hollow until it is backed by lived, personal experience. The moment a person actually completes the difficult workout they did not feel like doing, actually resists the impulsive purchase they were tempted to make, actually follows through on the commitment they almost abandoned, something shifts internally that no external validation could ever replicate. They now possess direct, irrefutable proof, gathered through their own actions rather than borrowed from someone else's encouragement. This accumulated proof becomes the foundation of what might be called earned confidence, fundamentally different from the more fragile, unearned confidence that comes from simply believing positive things about oneself without supporting evidence. Unearned confidence collapses easily under real pressure because it was never tested against anything difficult. Earned confidence, built through repeated, voluntary confrontation with friction and discomfort, tends to hold firm precisely because it has already been tested, repeatedly, under conditions that genuinely could have gone the other way. This distinction matters enormously, because the world will inevitably present circumstances far more challenging than any controlled, voluntary discomfort a person chooses to practice. A genuine crisis, an unexpected loss, a serious setback. These moments do not announce themselves in advance or arrive on a convenient schedule. They demand reserves of resilience and discipline that simply cannot be improvised in the moment if they have not already been built. Gradually, through countless smaller confrontations with difficulty along the way. This is precisely why people who have spent years deliberately practicing voluntary discomfort often display a striking, almost unsettling calm when genuine adversity eventually strikes. They are not suppressing fear or pretending difficulty does not exist. They are drawing on an extensive, deeply internalized history of evidence, proving to themselves, through direct experience rather than mere belief, that they are someone who can endure hardship without falling apart. This internal stability, this quiet confidence, forged specifically through friction, represents one of the most valuable and most underappreciated outcomes of a disciplined life, arguably more valuable than any single external achievement that discipline happens to produce along the way. There is also a profound social dimension to this process that deserves attention, because identity is never built in pure isolation. The people surrounding you exert powerful, continuous influence over your own self-concept, often far more than most people consciously recognize. If your closest relationships consist primarily of people who consistently choose comfort over growth, who mock or dismiss ambitious effort as unnecessary or excessive, maintaining a disciplined identity becomes significantly more difficult. Not because your own internal resolve has weakened, but because you are constantly swimming against a social current, actively pulling you back toward the old, more comfortable identity. Conversely, surrounding yourself, even partially, with people who embody the discipline you are trying to build creates a powerful, reinforcing effect, making the desired identity feel more achievable, more normal, more like a realistic extension of your existing social world, rather than some impossibly distant aspiration, belonging only to a different category of person entirely. This does not require completely abandoning existing relationships or seeking out some idealized circle of hyper-disciplined acquaintances. It simply requires honest awareness of how your current social environment is shaping your sense of what is normal and achievable, and deliberate effort to seek out at least some exposure, whether through direct relationships, mentorship, or even carefully chosen content and communities, to people who are actively living the identity you are working to build. Identity, after all, does not form in a vacuum. It is constantly being negotiated against the backdrop of social context, and consciously curating that context is a legitimate, powerful lever available to anyone serious about transforming who they are over time. There is one final dimension worth addressing here: the private internal narrative a person constructs about their own history with friction and difficulty. Two people can experience nearly identical hardships, the same failed business, the same difficult breakup, the same physically demanding training period, and emerge with radically different self-concepts, depending entirely on how they later interpret that experience to themselves. One person frames the experience as proof of their own fragility, a story of something that happened to them, something that broke them, something to be avoided in the future at all costs. The other frames the exact same experience as proof of their own capacity, a story of something they moved through, survived, and grew from. The events themselves were identical. The resulting identity was not, because identity is shaped less by what actually happens and more by the story a person tells themselves afterward about what it meant. Learning to consciously author that internal narrative, choosing deliberately to frame past friction as evidence of capability rather than as a wound to be nursed indefinitely, is itself a discipline, perhaps one of the most consequential ones a person can ever practice. Chapter 10. The Discipline of Recovery. There is a fundamental misunderstanding embedded in how most people think about discipline, one that causes tremendous unnecessary suffering and frequently destroys otherwise promising progress. This misunderstanding treats discipline as synonymous with perfection, as an unbroken streak that must never falter, where a single missed day, a single lapse, a single moment of giving in to temptation represents total failure, proof that the entire effort was somehow fraudulent from the start. This belief is not only inaccurate, it is actively destructive, because it transforms an inevitable, normal part of any long-term behavior change process into a catastrophic identity crisis. And identity crises are exactly the kind of event that causes people to abandon entire systems rather than simply continuing forward from wherever they currently stand. The truth, supported consistently across behavioral research, is that lapses are not the opposite of discipline. They are an expected, almost unavoidable part of the process for nearly every single person who eventually achieves lasting behavior change. What separates people who ultimately succeed from those who do not is rarely the complete absence of lapses. It is the speed and manner of recovery following those lapses. Two people might both miss a planned workout, both eat an unplanned, unhealthy meal, both skip a morning routine they had committed to. The person who treats this single lapse as isolated data course corrects immediately and returns to the plan the very next opportunity, experiences only a minor, temporary setback. The person who treats the same lapse as proof of fundamental personal failure often spirals into a much longer, much more damaging period of complete abandonment, sometimes lasting weeks or months, dramatically outweighing the actual cost of the original lapse itself. This phenomenon has a name in behavioral psychology, sometimes called the abstinence violation effect. Originally studied in the context of addiction recovery, but applicable across nearly every domain involving self-control. The core finding reveals something genuinely counterintuitive. The damage caused by a single lapse is rarely the lapse itself. The damage is almost entirely caused by the emotional and psychological spiral that follows the lapse, the shame, the self-criticism, the all-or-nothing thinking that concludes, since perfection has already been broken, there is no longer any point in continuing to try. This spiral transforms a single missed workout into an abandoned fitness goal entirely, transforms a single unhealthy meal into a complete collapse of an entire eating pattern, transforms one morning of sleeping through an alarm into the complete dissolution of an early rising habit that had taken months to build. Understanding this dynamic changes the entire emotional posture one should hold toward inevitable setbacks. Rather than treating perfection as the goal, with any deviation representing failure, the far more sustainable and ultimately more effective framework treats consistency over time as the actual goal, a framework that explicitly accounts for, and even expects, occasional lapses as a normal part of the process, rather than evidence that the process itself has failed. This is sometimes captured in the simple but powerful principle, never miss twice. Missing once is an accident, a normal, expected fluctuation in an otherwise consistent pattern. Missing twice in a row begins establishing a new pattern, one that, left unaddressed, can quickly become the new default. The goal, then, is never flawless, uninterrupted perfection. The goal is simply ensuring that any single lapse remains exactly that, a single, isolated event, rather than the beginning of a longer collapse. This reframing also requires developing genuine self-compassion, a concept frequently misunderstood as being in opposition to discipline, when in fact, research consistently shows the opposite relationship. Self-compassion, properly understood, is not self-indulgence or making excuses for poor behavior. It is the practice of treating yourself with the same reasonable, balanced understanding you would extend to a friend who experienced a similar setback, acknowledging the difficulty honestly without spiraling into excessive self-punishment that ultimately serves no productive purpose. Studies examining this relationship have found that people who practice self-compassion following a setback are significantly more likely to return to their goals quickly than people who respond to the same setback with harsh self-criticism. Shame, despite its reputation as a powerful motivator, tends to produce avoidance and withdrawal rather than renewed effort, while a more balanced, compassionate response tends to produce exactly the kind of quick recovery that minimizes the actual damage caused by any individual lapse. This does not mean lowering standards or accepting mediocrity disguised as self-kindness. It means recognizing a crucial distinction between standards and self-talk. It is entirely possible, and in fact essential, to hold extremely high standards for your own behavior, while simultaneously maintaining a fair, balanced, non-catastrophizing internal dialogue when those standards are occasionally missed. The two are not in conflict. In fact, the evidence suggests that the combination of high standards paired with self-compassionate recovery produces dramatically better long-term outcomes than either harsh self-criticism alone or low standards alone could ever achieve independently. Discipline, properly understood, was never about never falling. It was always about how quickly and how gracefully you return to your feet once you inevitably do. There is a practical tool worth mentioning here that makes this entire recovery process significantly easier to execute in real life. The simple act of visibly tracking consistency over time rather than judging each individual day in isolation. When progress is recorded somewhere visible, a calendar with marks for each completed day, a simple checklist, any tangible record that accumulates over weeks and months, a single missed day becomes immediately visible for what it actually is. One small gap surrounded by a much larger pattern of consistency. This visual context makes the all-or-nothing spiral far less likely to take hold, because the evidence sitting directly in front of you contradicts the catastrophic story that one slip means total failure. The eye is naturally drawn to the overall pattern rather than the single broken link. And that shift in perspective alone, gained simply through the act of tracking, often does more to protect long-term consistency than any amount of willpower applied in the moment of temptation itself. We have now built a far more complete picture, the mechanical architecture of habits, the modern assault on delayed gratification, the physiological foundation that discipline actually rests upon, the deeper identity transformation that friction quietly produces over time, and the essential, often overlooked skill of recovering quickly from inevitable setbacks. In the final section ahead, we move into the practical application of everything covered so far, the specific frameworks, daily structures, and long-term strategies required to turn this understanding into a permanent, lived transformation. Chapter 11. The Discipline of Decision. There is a hidden cost buried inside ordinary daily life that almost nobody accounts for, and it has nothing to do with time or money in the way those resources are usually measured. It has to do with decisions themselves. The sheer number of them a person makes across an average day, and the cumulative toll each one quietly extracts from the same limited cognitive resource discussed earlier in this script. Research examining decision-making has consistently found that the quality of choices tends to deteriorate as the number of prior choices in a given period increases, regardless of how important or trivial those earlier choices happen to be. A decision about which shirt to wear draws from the exact same well as a decision about whether to confront a difficult colleague. And by the time the genuinely important decisions of the day arrive, that well has often already been significantly drained by dozens of smaller, less consequential ones. This phenomenon explains a curious pattern observed among some of the most effective, high-output individuals across very different fields, a tendency to dramatically simplify low-stakes decisions in order to preserve mental energy for the decisions that actually matter. Wearing a nearly identical outfit every day, eating the same few meals on repeat rather than deliberating over options at every sitting, following rigid, predetermined routines for the early parts of the day, so that no cognitive energy is spent deciding what comes next. To an outside observer, this can look like a lack of variety or even a strange kind of rigidity. But to the person actually living it, this simplification is a deliberate, strategic choice, a recognition that decision-making capacity is finite, and that every unnecessary choice eliminated from the day is additional capacity preserved for the choices that genuinely deserve it. This principle has a name worth knowing: decision fatigue, and understanding it transforms how a person should think about structuring their day. Rather than treating every moment as an open field of equally available options, requiring fresh deliberation each time, the more strategic approach involves identifying which decisions in a typical day are genuinely consequential and which are simply noise dressed up as choice. The consequential ones deserve full, fresh cognitive resources, ideally tackled earlier in the day before fatigue accumulates. The trivial ones deserve to be automated, simplified, or eliminated entirely wherever possible, freeing up exactly the kind of mental bandwidth that would otherwise be silently drained away by mid-afternoon, leaving nothing left for the moments that truly require careful, disciplined thought. This is also why establishing firm, predetermined rules in advance proves so much more effective than relying on in-the-moment judgment for situations that repeat themselves regularly. A person who has decided in advance, with a clear mind, that they do not drink alcohol on weeknights, no longer has to relitigate that decision every single evening when a drink is offered. The decision has already been made once, calmly, rationally, and it simply needs to be applied rather than reconsidered from scratch under the influence of fatigue, social pressure, or a depleted state of willpower. This is a profoundly underused strategy, the deliberate conversion of recurring decisions into fixed rules, eliminating the need for repeated deliberation and, by extension, eliminating the repeated opportunity for fatigue-driven failure that comes with treating every instance as a brand new choice, requiring fresh resolve. There is an important nuance here worth addressing directly, because rigid rule following can occasionally tip into something unhealthy if taken to an extreme, removing all flexibility and turning discipline into rigid, anxious control rather than calm, deliberate structure. The goal is not to eliminate every form of spontaneity or joy from daily life in pursuit of mechanical efficiency. The goal is to apply this principle selectively to the genuinely repetitive, low-value decisions that drain energy without adding meaningful benefit, while preserving full flexibility and presence for the moments, relationships, and choices that actually deserve thoughtful, fresh consideration. Used correctly, this approach does not shrink a person's life. It expands the available space for what actually matters, by clearing away the constant, invisible clutter of decisions that never needed to be decisions at all. There is a related concept worth exploring here: the surprising power of default options in shaping eventual behavior. Research across many different domains has consistently found that whatever option requires the least active effort to select tends to be chosen dramatically more often than alternatives, even when those alternatives are only marginally more difficult to access. This is why countries that automatically enroll citizens in retirement savings programs requiring active effort to opt out rather than active effort to opt in see dramatically higher participation rates than countries relying on voluntary enrollment, even though the actual financial decision being offered is identical in both cases. The lesson translates directly into personal discipline. Whatever requires the least friction to do becomes the default behavior over time, almost regardless of conscious intention, which means one of the most powerful levers available to anyone serious about behavior change is simply auditing which behaviors currently sit at the lowest friction default position in their own life and deliberately re-engineering that position so the disciplined choice, rather than the easy one, becomes the path requiring the least effort to follow. Consider, for a moment, how this principle could be applied directly to a recurring decision currently working against you. If unhealthy snacking happens to be the lowest friction default in your kitchen simply because the unhealthy option sits at eye level while the healthier alternative requires searching through a cupboard, the default has already been engineered, just not by you and not in your favor. Reclaiming that default, swapping which option sits closest, most visible, most accessible, is not a trivial cosmetic change. It is a direct intervention into the exact mechanism research has shown to be one of the most powerful predictors of actual behavior, often more powerful than conscious intention or stated preference ever turns out to be in practice. There is one additional practice worth introducing here: the deliberate batching of similar decisions into a single, dedicated block of time rather than scattering them throughout the day. A person who decides what to wear each morning in the moment, decides what to eat for each meal in the moment, and decides what tasks to prioritize in the moment is essentially paying the full cognitive cost of decision-making dozens of separate times across a single day. A person who instead batches these decisions, selecting an entire week of outfits in one sitting, planning meals in a single dedicated session, mapping out priorities the night before rather than each individual morning, pays that same cognitive cost only once, in a single concentrated block, rather than repeatedly throughout the day in smaller, more fatiguing increments. This batching approach does not eliminate the underlying decisions. It simply relocates them to a single, deliberate moment when cognitive resources are fresh, rather than allowing them to silently drain resources throughout the day in a way that compounds against exactly the kind of decision fatigue this chapter has been examining. Chapter 12. The Discipline of Boundaries. Self-discipline is too often discussed exclusively in terms of personal habits, exercise routines, eating patterns, morning rituals, as though it operates in a vacuum entirely separate from other people. This framing misses something essential. A significant portion of the discipline failures most people experience are not failures of internal willpower at all. They are failures of boundaries, the inability or unwillingness to say no to other people's requests, expectations, and demands on time and energy that should, by rights, belong to one's own goals and priorities. Consider how often a carefully planned morning routine collapses, not because of internal temptation, but because of an external interruption. An unexpected phone call accepted out of social obligation, a last-minute favor agreed to despite an already full schedule, a conversation that runs long because ending it felt socially uncomfortable. None of these moments involve a craving or an impulse in the traditional sense. They involve the much quieter, much more socially complicated failure to protect one's own time and energy from the reasonable but ultimately competing needs of other people. This is discipline too, just a less obvious, less frequently discussed form of it. And for many people, it represents the single largest unaddressed leak in their entire system of self-control. The discomfort of saying no deserves direct, honest examination, because it explains why boundary setting proves so much harder for most people than dietary or exercise discipline ever does. Saying no carries genuine social risk. The possibility of disappointing someone, of being perceived as selfish or difficult, of damaging a relationship that matters. This risk is real, not imagined. And pretending it does not exist does a disservice to anyone genuinely trying to build stronger boundaries. But the alternative carries its own very real cost, one that tends to be paid silently, gradually, and invisibly. the slow erosion of personal goals, energy, and even self-respect that accumulates when a person consistently prioritizes the comfort of others over the integrity of their own stated priorities. A useful reframe here involves recognizing that every yes given to something misaligned with your priorities is simultaneously a no given to something that actually matters to you, even though that hidden cost rarely feels as immediate or as visible as the social discomfort of a direct refusal. Saying yes to an unnecessary obligation on a given evening is, in effect, saying no to the workout that evening was meant to hold, no to the rest that was needed, no to the project that required that block of focused time. Reframing boundaries this way, not as selfish acts of refusal, but as honest acknowledgments of an unavoidable trade-off that already exists, whether or not it is named, often makes the discomfort of saying no feel more bearable, because the alternative is finally seen clearly for what it actually is, not generosity, but a quiet, repeated abandonment of one's own stated commitments. Practically speaking, boundary discipline benefits enormously from many of the same principles already covered in this script. Just as environmental design reduces the need for in-the-moment willpower around food or screens, predetermined boundary scripts reduce the need for in-the-moment willpower around social requests. Having a simple, rehearsed phrase ready in advance, something like, "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I'm not able to take that on right now," removes the burden of having to construct a justification on the spot under social pressure, often the exact condition under which boundaries are most likely to collapse. The script does not need to be elaborate or even particularly clever. Its entire value lies in its existence, in the fact that it can be deployed automatically without requiring fresh willpower or fresh courage every single time a boundary needs to be held. It is also worth naming directly that boundary discipline tends to strengthen with practice in much the same way physical discomfort tolerance does, discussed earlier in this script. The first few times a boundary is held against social pressure, it feels intensely uncomfortable, sometimes almost unbearably so. But this discomfort, much like the discomfort of a cold shower or a difficult workout, is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the exact mechanism through which the capacity for healthy boundaries is built. Over time, with repeated practice, the discomfort genuinely does diminish, not because the social risk disappears, but because the nervous system gradually learns, through direct, repeated evidence, that holding a boundary does not produce the catastrophic social rupture it once feared. This is, in its own way, simply another form of voluntary discomfort, applied not to physical hardship, but to the social discomfort of honoring one's own priorities over the immediate comfort of others. It is worth distinguishing clearly between guilt and genuine moral failure in this context, because the two are frequently confused in ways that quietly undermine boundary discipline before it ever has a chance to take hold. Guilt, as an emotional signal, often arrives automatically whenever a person disappoints someone else's expectations, regardless of whether that disappointment was actually unreasonable to cause. This means guilt, on its own, is an unreliable indicator of whether a boundary was actually wrong to hold. A person can feel intense guilt after declining a reasonable request and feel almost no guilt at all after agreeing to something that genuinely violated their own well-being, because guilt tracks social disruption far more reliably than it tracks actual ethical correctness. Learning to notice guilt without automatically treating it as proof of wrongdoing is an essential, often overlooked skill for anyone trying to build stronger boundaries. Allowing the discomfort to be acknowledged honestly while still permitting the boundary itself to remain firmly in place. There is a particular pattern worth naming explicitly, because it tends to sneak up gradually rather than arriving all at once. The slow accumulation of overcommitment that occurs when each individual yes seems reasonable in isolation, but the cumulative total quietly exceeds what any single person can sustainably deliver. A single additional obligation rarely feels significant enough to refuse on its own. It is only when viewed against the full backdrop of everything else already committed to that the true cost becomes visible, by which point the obligation has often already been verbally agreed to, making it significantly harder to walk back than it would have been to decline in the first place. This is precisely why maintaining some form of ongoing, honest awareness of total current commitments, rather than evaluating each new request purely in isolation, proves so valuable. A request that seems entirely reasonable on its own merits may still warrant a firm no, not because the request itself is unreasonable, but because the existing total has already reached genuine capacity, and protecting that capacity is itself an essential, if frequently invisible, form of discipline. Chapter 13. The Long Game. There is a particular kind of patience required for genuine, lasting self-discipline that runs counter to almost everything modern culture teaches about achievement and progress. The dominant cultural narrative around transformation tends to favor dramatic, visible, rapid change, the 60-day challenge, the before and after photo, the overnight success story stripped of all the unglamorous years that actually preceded it. This narrative, however appealing, sets up an almost guaranteed collision with reality, because nearly every meaningful, durable form of personal transformation actually unfolds across a timescale measured in years, not weeks, through a process so gradual that it often feels, from the inside, like almost nothing is happening at all. This creates a particularly dangerous psychological trap for anyone genuinely committed to long-term discipline. The early months of any serious behavior change typically involve significant effort with comparatively modest, visible results, a deeply discouraging ratio that causes an enormous number of people to abandon their efforts at precisely the moment they are closest to a tipping point that would have made the entire process feel dramatically easier going forward. This pattern shows up across nearly every domain where compounding plays a role. Financial growth, through consistent saving and investing, looks nearly flat for years before the mathematics of compounding interest begins producing genuinely dramatic results. Physical strength built through consistent training feels frustratingly slow for months before visible, undeniable changes accumulate. Skill development in almost any complex domain follows an almost identical pattern: painfully slow, often invisible early progress, followed eventually by an acceleration that can feel, in retrospect, almost sudden, even though it was actually built entirely on the unglamorous consistency that came before it. Understanding this pattern in advance changes how a person should interpret the experience of early effort with minimal visible reward. Rather than treating this period as evidence that the chosen approach is not working, it should be understood as the expected, unavoidable cost of admission into any process governed by compounding. The frustration is not a signal to quit. It is simply what the early stage of nearly every worthwhile long-term process actually feels like from the inside: indistinguishable, in the moment, from the early stage of an approach that genuinely is not working, which is precisely why so many people abandon promising efforts that would have eventually paid off handsomely had they simply continued a little further. This raises an important practical question. How does a person sustain effort across a timescale long enough for compounding to actually take effect when the early experience offers so little in the way of immediate reinforcement? Part of the answer lies in deliberately shifting the source of reward away from outcomes and toward process itself. A person whose sense of success depends entirely on visible external results will struggle enormously during the long, quiet middle stretch of any compounding process, because external results simply are not arriving on a timeline fast enough to sustain motivation. A person who has learned instead to find genuine satisfaction in the act of consistency itself, in showing up, in keeping a commitment to themselves regardless of immediate visible payoff, possesses a far more sustainable source of motivation, one that does not depend on the cooperation of external circumstances or timing. This shift from outcome-dependent motivation to process-dependent motivation represents one of the most mature and most powerful evolutions a person can undergo in their relationship with discipline. It does not mean outcomes stop mattering. It means the daily emotional experience of pursuing those outcomes no longer hinges entirely on their arrival, freeing a person to continue showing up with genuine consistency through the long, quiet, often invisible middle stretch where the actual compounding is taking place, well before any of it becomes visible to the outside world, or even fully visible to the person living through it themselves. There is a specific, well-documented experience worth preparing for in advance, sometimes referred to as the plateau, a stretch of time, often arriving after the initial encouraging gains of a new discipline have already been achieved, where progress appears to stall almost entirely. Despite continued consistent effort, this plateau is one of the most common points at which people abandon otherwise sound, promising efforts, interpreting the apparent lack of visible progress as proof that something has gone wrong, when in reality, plateaus are an expected, almost universal feature of nearly any process governed by adaptation and compounding. The body, the mind, and complex systems generally do not progress in smooth, linear lines. They progress in stair-steps, periods of visible gain followed by periods of apparent stagnation, during which substantial underlying adaptation is actually still taking place, simply not yet expressing itself in a form that is externally measurable. Trusting this process during the plateau, continuing to show up with full consistency even when the scoreboard appears frozen, is often the single greatest test separating those who eventually break through to the next visible level of progress from those who quietly give up at the exact moment they were closest to it. A final danger worth naming directly in this context involves comparison, specifically the tendency to measure one's own slow, compounding progress against the visible, polished highlight reels of other people's timelines, particularly as displayed across social media, where years of unglamorous, invisible effort are almost never shown, and only the eventual dramatic results ever make it into view. This comparison creates a deeply distorted picture of how long meaningful change actually takes, leading many people to conclude, mistakenly, that their own pace must be uniquely slow or uniquely flawed, when in reality they are simply comparing their own visible beginning against someone else's invisible middle or carefully edited end. Protecting against this distortion requires deliberate, conscious effort, a willingness to measure progress only against one's own prior position rather than against an external timeline that was never an accurate, honest representation of the actual process to begin with. Chapter 14. When discipline becomes identity. There comes a point for those who genuinely sustain disciplined behavior across a long enough period of time where something subtle but profound shifts in the underlying experience of the behavior itself. The early years of any discipline-building journey are characterized by ongoing internal negotiation, a persistent, conscious tension between the part of the self that wants to do the disciplined thing and the part that resists it. This negotiation, exhausting as it can be, is a completely normal and necessary stage. But for those who continue long enough, something genuinely interesting begins to happen. The negotiation quiets. The internal resistance, while never disappearing entirely, becomes dramatically less frequent and less intense. The disciplined behavior stops feeling like an act of discipline at all and starts feeling like simply an accurate description of who the person already is. This transition deserves careful attention because it explains a phenomenon that often confuses people earlier in their own journey: the observation that certain individuals seem to maintain extraordinary consistency with what appears to be almost no visible effort or internal struggle. This is not because these individuals possess some innate trait the rest of us lack. It is because they have already passed through the earlier, more effortful stages described throughout this script, and the disciplined behavior has fully integrated into their identity, no longer requiring the conscious, effortful negotiation it once demanded. What looks effortless from the outside is, in nearly every documented case, simply the far end of a long process that was, at one point, every bit as difficult for them as it currently is for anyone earlier in their own journey. This integration represents the true, ultimate goal of everything covered throughout this entire script. Not a permanent state of gritted teeth resistance against temptation, sustained indefinitely through sheer force of will, but a genuine transformation of identity so complete that the disciplined behavior simply becomes the default, the path of least resistance, the thing that now feels most natural and aligned. This does not mean temptation disappears entirely, nor does it mean difficulty vanishes from life altogether. It means the baseline orientation has fundamentally shifted from a person who must constantly fight against their own impulses in order to behave with discipline to a person whose impulses themselves have been gradually reshaped through the long accumulation of identity-aligned action described throughout this entire script, to actually point in the direction of the disciplined behavior more often than not. It is worth being honest about something here, as this chapter draws toward its conclusion. This level of integration is not achieved quickly, and it is not achieved by everyone who begins the journey. It requires sustained effort across a meaningful span of time, genuine willingness to endure the early, effortful stages without abandoning the process prematurely, and consistent application of the principles already covered: environmental design, identity-based language, recovery from inevitable lapses, physiological foundation, decision simplification, and boundary protection. But for those who do sustain the process long enough, the reward is not merely the specific outcomes that discipline produces: the health, the financial stability, the achievement, the relationships protected by healthy boundaries. The reward is something deeper and more permanent than any single outcome: a fundamentally transformed relationship with one's own mind, a quiet, durable confidence built not on hope or belief, but on extensive, repeated, lived evidence that you are someone capable of doing what you say you will do, regardless of how you happen to feel about it in any given moment. This is, in the end, what separates a person who occasionally manages disciplined behavior from a person who has genuinely become a disciplined person. The first relies on motivation, mood, and circumstance, succeeding when conditions happen to align, and struggling when they do not. The second has built something far more stable underneath all of that: an identity, an environment, a set of internalized rules and recovered lapses that no longer depends nearly so heavily on the unreliable, ever-shifting conditions of daily life. This is the destination toward which every principle in this script has been quietly pointing. Not perfection, never perfection, but a genuine, durable transformation of who you actually are beneath the surface of any single day's particular mood or circumstance. There is a final, humbling truth worth naming clearly before moving toward the conclusion of this entire journey. Even at this advanced stage of integration, where discipline has largely become identity, the underlying architecture covered throughout this script never becomes entirely irrelevant or unnecessary. New circumstances, new seasons of life, new sources of stress or disruption can, and occasionally do, destabilize even deeply integrated identities, requiring a return to some of the more deliberate, effortful strategies covered earlier. Environmental redesign, recovery from lapses, renewed boundary scripts. This is not a sign of regression or failure. It is simply an honest acknowledgement that mastery, in this domain as in nearly every other, is never a permanent, finished state immune to all future disruption, but rather an ongoing relationship, one that occasionally requires returning to fundamentals, even for those who have walked this particular road for a very long time. There is also a particular warning sign worth watching for as discipline becomes increasingly identity integrated, a subtle drift from healthy structure into something closer to rigid, anxious compulsion, where the disciplined behavior is no longer chosen freely but instead performed out of fear. A fear that any deviation will somehow unravel the entire identity that has been so carefully constructed. This drift can be difficult to notice from the inside because it often looks identical to genuine discipline from the outside, the same consistency, the same visible follow-through. The distinguishing factor lies in the internal emotional texture accompanying the behavior. Genuine, healthy discipline, even at its most demanding, carries an underlying sense of choice and alignment. Compulsive rigidity carries an underlying current of anxiety and threat, as though the entire self would collapse should a single instance be missed. Recognizing this distinction matters enormously, because the goal of everything covered throughout this script was never to trade one form of suffering, the suffering of undisciplined drift, for another, the suffering of anxious, joyless rigidity, but rather to arrive at a third, healthier place, entirely, one where structure serves freedom rather than replacing it. Chapter 15. Taking back control. We began this journey with a simple but uncomfortable observation that the quiet, almost invisible decisions made in ordinary, unremarkable moments quietly determine the entire trajectory of a life far more than any single dramatic event ever could. We have now traveled through the full architecture beneath that observation, the failure of pure willpower as a sustainable strategy, The internal neurological war between fast emotion and slow reason, the profound influence of environment over behavior, the silent override that identity exerts on even the most carefully designed systems, the hidden cost of excessive comfort, the mechanical structure of habit loops, the modern assault on delayed gratification, the physiological foundation that all discipline ultimately rests upon, the deeper transformation that friction produces in a person's relationship with their own capability, the necessary skill of recovering quickly from inevitable lapses, the often overlooked toll of decision fatigue, the quiet discipline embedded in protecting personal boundaries, the patience required to sustain effort across a timescale long enough for compounding to take effect, and finally, the eventual integration where discipline stops feeling like an external demand and becomes, instead, simply who a person is. None of this was ever meant to be absorbed purely as information, filed away alongside countless other pieces of content consumed and quickly forgotten. The entire value of everything covered here lies exclusively in application, in the deliberate, repeated choice to actually use these principles in the ordinary, unremarkable moments of an actual life, starting not at some future date when conditions feel more convenient, but starting now, today, in whatever moment immediately follows the conclusion of this video. It is worth returning one final time to the phrase that gave this entire video its title. Control yourself before life controls you. This is not a threat or a scare tactic. It is simply an honest description of how human existence actually works. There is no neutral, passive state where nothing is shaping your behavior, your habits, your eventual trajectory. Either you are actively, deliberately authoring your own life through the principles covered throughout this script: environmental design, identity alignment, physiological foundation, recovery from lapses, protected boundaries, patient persistence through the invisible early stages of compounding, or you are being authored by default, by whatever environment happens to surround you, by whatever algorithm happens to be optimized to capture your attention, by whatever social pressure happens to be loudest in any given moment, by whatever impulse happens to fire first in the absence of any deliberate structure standing in its way. This choice is not made once, dramatically, in some single defining moment. It is made continuously, in thousands of small, unremarkable instances, scattered across every single day, each one seemingly insignificant in isolation, each one quietly compounding into the entire shape of a life over months and years. The good news embedded inside this reality is that it means transformation is always available, starting from exactly wherever you currently stand, regardless of how many past attempts have ended in frustration or how distant the desired identity might currently feel. The architecture covered throughout this script does not require a perfect starting point. It only requires a willingness to begin applying it. Imperfectly, inconsistently at first, and then, with gradually increasing consistency, exactly as described in the chapters on habit formation and recovery from lapses. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a small, specific action available to you, one that aligns with the identity you actually want to build, rather than the one you have simply inherited through years of default behavior. Perhaps it is removing a single source of friction from your environment tonight. Perhaps it is identifying one recurring decision that could be converted into a fixed rule. Perhaps it is rehearsing a simple boundary script you have been avoiding using. Perhaps it is something as small and as deceptively powerful as a single push-up, a single page read, a single glass of water chosen over a different option. Not because that one action will transform your life on its own, but because it casts a vote, the first of many, toward the identity you are quietly, deliberately choosing to become. It is worth pausing here to address something honestly, because pretending otherwise would betray the entire spirit of everything covered throughout this script. None of this is easy. None of it offers some shortcut around the basic, unavoidable reality that meaningful change requires sustained effort over meaningful time. Anyone promising instant transformation, painless discipline, or effortless willpower achieved through a single trick or hack is selling something that does not actually exist, no matter how appealing the packaging. What has been offered here instead is something more honest and, in the long run, far more valuable. A clear, accurate map of how discipline actually works beneath the surface, stripped of the moralizing, the shame, and the oversimplified slogans that have left so many people feeling broken for failing at something that was never explained to them correctly in the first place. Consider, for a moment, the version of yourself 1 year from today, having applied even a fraction of what has been covered throughout this script, with reasonable, imperfect consistency. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, because setbacks, as established clearly throughout this material, are an expected and entirely survivable part of the process, rather than evidence of failure. Simply consistently, in the way described throughout the chapters on habit formation, identity, and recovery, the environment slowly reshaped to support rather than undermine your goals. The internal language shifted from fixed, limiting labels toward an honest, evolving sense of becoming. The physiological foundation strengthened through better sleep, better nutrition, more consistent movement. The boundaries held, awkwardly at first. Then, with gradually increasing ease, the recurring decisions simplified into fixed rules, freeing mental energy for what actually matters. The lapses, when they inevitably occur, met with self-compassion rather than spiraling shame, and followed quickly by a return to the plan rather than a prolonged abandonment of it. That version of you, 1 year out, would not be unrecognizable in some dramatic, cinematic sense. The change would have been gradual, almost invisible day to day, exactly as compounding always operates. But stacked across an entire year, those small, consistent choices would have produced a genuinely different trajectory, a different relationship with your own mind, a different set of automatic behaviors quietly running in the background of an ordinary day. This is not a promise of ease. It is a promise of possibility, grounded not in motivational sentiment but in the actual, well-documented mechanics of how human behavior change genuinely works, mechanics that have now been laid out for you in full across this entire script. The hidden power of self-discipline was never about becoming someone superhuman, immune to temptation, immune to fatigue, immune to the very real difficulty of being a flawed, evolving human being navigating a world engineered against sustained attention and patience. It was always about something far more achievable and far more powerful, precisely because of how achievable it actually is. The steady, patient construction of a life where your actions, day after day, in ways large and small, genuinely belong to you, not to your impulses, not to your environment by default, not to whatever algorithm or expectation happens to be pulling hardest in any given moment. To you. That is the real hidden power waiting underneath everything covered throughout this entire script, and it is available to you starting from exactly where you stand right now. This is also, perhaps, the most important reframe of all. The recognition that discipline was never meant to be a punishment imposed on yourself for the crime of being human, riddled with cravings, impulses, and moments of weakness. It was always meant to be an act of deep, genuine self-respect, a quiet, ongoing demonstration that your own future well-being matters enough to you that you are willing to make deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable choices on its behalf, today and tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as it takes for those choices to stop feeling like discipline at all and simply become the natural, unremarkable shape of who you have become. That, ultimately, is the destination this entire journey has been pointing toward from the very first sentence of this script to this final one. And it remains, as it always has, entirely within your reach, starting now.